In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Welcome back to another edition of the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. This is your host, Grizzlies beat writer Drew Hill, joined as always by columnist Chris Herrington. I come to you live from a back room of the Marriott Marquis in Chicago. I don't know if I'll get kicked out of this room in the middle of the podcast. It's completely empty. There's like a bunch of empty chairs in here. But hopefully we get through this. It's been a big week. Starting on Sunday, the Grizzlies had were part of the NBA draft lottery. Unfortunately, they did not get lucky. They finished with the number 9 pick. So, Chris, what were your initial reactions? I'll get into being in the lottery room, all that in just a minute. But just quick reaction. Number 9, what was your first thought?
Given your circumstances, I'd make a Drew is searching for Al Capone's vault joke, but that's probably well before your time. Speaking of being in back rooms in Chicago, I felt like this was I said leading up, this was a pretty low stakes lottery. You always want to get up as high as you can. And it was a bummer to drop down 2 spots. I mean, the Grizzlies' most likely scenario was to drop down 1 spot. That's where the math told you the most likely individual spot was 8. To drop down 2 was a little bit of a surprise and an unwelcome surprise, but I didn't feel like this was a lottery where the stakes were particularly high relative to the outcome, relative to some of the ones the franchise has had in the past. So my attitude was like, okay, now move forward.
I think your attitude was reflected, is exactly what Zach Kleiman reflected inside of that room when he saw the numbers. Like, there was no smack of the knee, darn it. Like, we didn't move. Like, none of that was the case.
Right.
Like, it was pretty clear that they went into this lottery saying, okay, we just need to be prepared to draft 7, 8, or 9. And if we move up, great, and we'll adjust accordingly. But we need to first be prepared for what is probably the most likely outcome. And I got that sense from being in that room. It was a little cruel because I've said this multiple places by now. The first ping pong ball, they needed it to be 4 or 5, and it came out as 6 or 3 on 3 different occasions. So it was very close.
Right.
Not that you can gauge those sort of things. I mean, the ping pong balls are flying around a machine, but based on number, it was close. But it did not go their way. Obviously, they get jumped by 2 teams. One being Atlanta, one being a team in the division in Houston. So that's obviously not good. But my initial reaction too was, this is not a secret. Zach Kleiman said we're either going to take the best available player or we're going to trade the pick. I do wonder if we're going to trade the pick.
Yeah, but what other option is there? We're going to take the not best available player. I mean, no one's going to say that. I was going to say we're going to take the 3rd best available player.
I guess he could say we're going to take the best available big, but that doesn't make any sense either. Yeah, I get it. But I brought that up mainly just to make the point. Part of me does believe that maybe it's a little bit more likely that this pick gets traded now, because if you felt really good about one of those bigs that you could get inside of the top 4, I'm speaking specifically about Klingon, who you might. I mean, there's an outside chance he could be at 9. Or Sarr, if one of those bigs is there and you felt good enough that player was ready to step in and be your starting center, I think it could impact the way that you go about this offseason and the path that you decide to take. But given the situation now, I do wonder if it's more likely to get traded.
Well, I think it's interesting because that cuts both ways. I mean, the pick being at 9 instead of higher up makes it less valuable to you, but in turn, that also makes it less valuable as a trade chip. I do think, to your specific point, to me, fans and people from the outside have invested in the Grizzlies this notion that they want to, that if they can, they want to get their starting center out of the draft. And I just don't know if that's true. I don't know that it's not, but I've never gotten the clear sense that yes, that the Grizzlies were like it's all in on Clinginnis, the guy we need to get out of this draft, as fans were. I just don't know about that.
Yeah, I think it just alters the most convenient option.
Yeah, no, and it may be the option that I prefer. I'm not saying I'm not saying I disagree with the fan consensus, because I think I might actually agree with it. But I don't know that was the team's stance. It would have been interesting to find out. Like if they had jumped up to third and then like Klingon's on the board at third and they had picked someone else, like that would have been really interesting if that had happened. I think they want to win. They've talked about sustainable success and they value that, but they really want to win as big as they can next season. And so, if there's something available in a trade that is going to help you more next season than the one you're going to pick at number 9, I think they're going to be very, very willing to do that, very interested in doing that. I also think, and we've talked about this before, there's the financial tightening that's going on. And if there's a way using that pick in a trade that can both make you better next season and sort of make it easier to manage, I think all those things are going to come into play.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you do save a little bit of money with the pick being at 9. It's funny, Chris, you and I, not publicly, we had a conversation the other night because this does put the Grizzlies on the edge of the first apron. And I think by your math, they were coming in slightly under. I just ran into Bobby Marks in the hallway here at the hotel, and I asked Bobby Marks about this, who's obviously, he's ESPN's math guy on salaries and stuff like that. He believes that actually it will put the Grizzlies over, and the reason he believes so is because bonuses have to be factored in, and there are a few bonuses that would actually, one being Brandon Clark, that would actually put the Grizzlies potentially over that first apron if all they decided to do was to pick up Luke Kennard's option and draft a player at number 9. But for people that are
the other thing to factor in is are they going to carry 14 or 15 players? And I believe they're going to carry 15. And so even if it's like that second round pick, at number 39 that you put on a minimum contract, that's also money that's gonna go to it too. So yeah, I think it's very close, but it's not. I've got it slightly under, but I think it's very close, and I do think it could, depending on the way everything is accounted, it could shift over that line.
I always try to keep this as simple as possible, but for people that are listening to us discuss this right now that may not know what we're talking about, maybe a little bit more of a casual Grizzlies fan, could you try to put it in simple terms for everyone?
Well, so the NBA is for a long time has had a salary cap and a luxury tax, and those are two different lines, right? There's a salary cap line, and the salary cap line is you can't go over this number unless you're doing it, to re-sign your own player and to do all of this kind of stuff. Most teams operate above the salary cap, even though it's called a cap. And then there's a line significantly higher than that. That's the luxury tax line. And that's the line where when you go over that, suddenly you're paying a financial penalty to go over. So those two things have been in place for a long time. I think most fans are at least roughly conversant in those two concepts, the salary cap and the luxury tax. What is sort of new in the new collective bargaining agreement is there are now different levels of luxury tax as you keep going up. And the language the NBA has used for the different lines or aprons. And so, the first level of luxury tax is below the first apron, because that's like, imagine a line. And the second level of luxury tax is below the second apron. And so as you cross these aprons, you move into new levels. And what happens is, as you go into extra levels, A, you have to pay more, but B, there are other restrictions that happen relative to roster moves you can do. It may stop you from taking back more salary in a trade. It might stop you from including cash money in a trade. It might stop you from signing a buyout player, all these kind of things. And so the Grizzlies right now are projected to be above the luxury tax, but somewhere around the line that goes from first level to second level, that first apron. And so I think most people who pay attention to the Grizzlies are operating under the assumption that they are willing to be into the luxury tax for the first time in a generation. The question that we don't know the answer to exactly is whether they're willing to cross the first line, which is that first apron, and then whether they're willing to cross the second line of the second apron. That is what is still a bit of a mystery.
And once you cross over that first apron, there are certain types of, you mentioned a few of them already, but there are certain types of deals. If you make them, then it in turn could also hard cap you. So if the Grizzlies do pick up Luke Kennard's option, which this is like the thing that kind of looms ahead of the draft, right? It's this $14.8 million option for Luke Kennard. And there's different avenues in which they can find themselves under that first apron still. But if they were to pick that up and they were to draft a player or two players, they would essentially be over that penalty line. And if they're over that penalty line and they choose to bring back more salary in a trade than they send out, now they're hard capped. So
there are other mechanisms somebody do it. I went and watched that you mentioned Bobby Marks. I went and watched the video that I could see him talking about this. And what he says in that video, and I have a lot of respect for Bobby Marks, but I found it sort of a little bit of an odd thing to pull out of nowhere. What he actually says in that video is, if you bring back Luke Kennard and you keep the pick, and then you send out $3 million in a trade for a pick, you will be hard capped, which is true. So that's sort of the extra thing, right? But I don't. Right. There's no reason to suspect that they would do that. But the Grizzlies are not going to be hard capped just because they keep Luke Kennard and they make the pick. But the restrictions add after that, and if you want to violate one of those restrictions, that's sort of like the second level. If you do something in the first level that's against the restrictions of the second, that's going to keep you from going into the second. So there are things that they could do that would hard cap them. My personal opinion is that the rule stuff on that doesn't matter that much, because I think they are effectively going to hard cap themselves. I don't think they're going to go into the second level of the tax, period. And so I just think that is, whether that's a technical hard cap or just we're not paying this much, I just think they're not going that far.
I mean, the other thing to consider is there's a $10 million gap between those aprons, the first and the second. So why would you barely go over the first if you could go well over the first? It's a question you should be asking.
Well, the only reason would be because of the money you're having to spend. That'd be the only reason. But from a team building standpoint, you're right. From a team building standpoint, if you're willing to go past the first line and unwilling to cross the second line, you might as well take advantage of all that space in between. Yes.
Okay, so let's go over some avenues. I do think it's a possibility that they could try to renegotiate with Luke Kennard. In fact, I'd be shocked if they're not trying to do that, to try to get back to get a cheaper price this year on a longer deal. And I also think, a trade is possible in which, and again, we don't know what the value of the pick is, and we won't know. Also, because this draft is so wide open, we probably won't know until draft night, because teams have no idea who will be available at 9. But you could also make a trade around that draft pick and maybe dump out some salary if you can't, if somebody has that level of interest. I mean, we don't know the answer to that. What do you think? I could ask you what you think the most likely scenario is, but it's almost an impossible question to answer because there's so many different avenues. What stands out to you, I guess, as maybe one of the clean options the Grizzlies could do this summer to add a significant big man and hold a good roster?
Well, I think the financial territory is tricky, but it has eased up at least slightly for two reasons over the last few weeks. One is the news that Yuta Watanabe is apparently going to opt out of his contract. That shaves some money. And then the draft pick fall into spots shaves some money. So you put those two things together, that's several $1 million of wiggle room that got shaved. And I think that matters a lot. I think keeping Luke Kennard and exercising the pick at 9 and adding a veteran center, I think it's really hard to check all three of those boxes at the same time. That is just not only because if you do that, that means you're not using Luke Kennard in a trade for the big. It means you're not getting that big with the pick. And so A, you're adding more money on top of those two things, but B, what mechanism are you using to get that player? You can't really do it in free agency because you're so deep into the tax. And I don't know what else you have of trade value. And so I don't quite see how those three things all happen separately from each other. It wouldn't surprise me to see the Grizzlies try to include some, to be ungenerous, some unwanted salary with the pick at 9, in some kind of trade. whether that's John Conchar or Zaire Williams, something like that, and do that to try to bring back a rotation big and then keep Luke Kennard. As a short-term thing, I think that makes some sense, but you're sort of foregoing some long-term upside of just taking a player at 9 who you would have on a 4-year rookie contract. So I think they have a lot of tough decisions to make.
I mean, Zach Kleiman's been praised for working on the margins, right? And he's gonna be asked to do it again, big time. And in a season where, you had Jaren on Inside the NBA or NBA on TNT essentially saying no more being the young team. Like we need to be big time contenders now. We're not young and hungry anymore. And so I think these moves are pretty important for the Grizzlies.
One thing they have going for them in terms of sustainability and having, players coming up, they just signed Vince Williams and Gigi Jackson to, what are now going into this next season, 3-year contracts at salaries that are basically back into the first round contracts. And so it's not like you have your young sort of entering their prime guys like Jaren Dez and Ja, and then you have the veteran role players. You do have talent coming up behind them. So it puts a little bit less stress on the need to add another young talent coming up behind them right now. And so to me, that does give you a little bit more leeway to try to use that pick in a trade that has more short-term impact on the team.
Okay, you want to talk a few draft prospects? Because I am here at the Combine.
Tell us what you've seen. Give us some sights and sounds.
Okay, so yesterday they did the physical testing and the medical testing. I stayed for the bigs in the morning. So I watched Klingon and Edie and Sar and that group of guys. I actually had to leave, so I didn't catch the guards in the afternoon. I don't know how much the Combine matters in evaluating these prospects. I suspect that the Grizzlies already have somewhat of a list together in terms of what their board looks like.
Let me ask you, was Filipowski part of that group as well?
He was, and I actually talked to Filipowski this morning. We should. I just had the story just published, so this podcast will be out well after it published, I'm sure.
Right. So hopefully you've already read that, but if you haven't, go to dailymemphian.com and check that out.
Right. There we go. Good tease, Chris. Of note, Zach Edey, not a lot of players will tell you who they're meeting with. Most of them have been advised by their agents to say, probably best you don't disclose that information. Zach Edey did not do that. Zach Edey straight up said, Memphis has been interested for them in a while, and I really like Memphis. And so to me, that was interesting because as we do the Edey and Klingon debate, it does feel like Edey's a lot more likely to be there at 9. He also mentioned in the area where the Grizzlies are picking might be the high end of where he might go in the draft.
I don't think it would. Let's be clear about something. I don't know if you agree, but I'm just going to say this. And I'm not advocating for it. I'm not saying I would do it, whatever. I don't care what mock drafts are telling you. It would not be wild to take Zach Edey at 9.
No, I don't think so either. And here's the thing. I like Klingon slightly more than I like Edey. But I will admit, there are lots of things, not lots. There are a few things that I think Edey clearly does better than Klingon. And because of that, I could see it. And I could also see it because in a way, they are very similar players in terms of being extremely high efficiency players. They are true giants. These guys are massive. I wish I was standing next to Klingon on multiple occasions, and I just cannot believe how big he is. I stand next to Jaren all the time, and maybe it's just because I'm used to it now, but these guys just seem even bigger and more giant than guys like that. And so I would believe it. I would believe it if you told me that the Grizzlies like Edey more than they like Klingon. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm just saying if you were trying to tell me that, if you were trying to convince me that they liked Edey more than they like Klingon, there is a world in which I could envision that is true.
To me, and I agree with you. I prefer Klingon. Klingon is easier to visualize transitioning into his NBA role because we know guys like this. He's not that different from Rudy Gobert. he may not be as good, but like you can see like that. You can see Steven Adams, right? You can see these defense rebounding players who fit as sort of secondary players in the offense. These kind of roles, elite defender rebounder types who don't need the ball a lot and can function in offense in other ways. Rim runners or high post passers, whatever. Clingan, it's easy to just see him in that role. I think people struggle with Edey for good reason. A, because guys his size, you wonder about defensively. And then B, like they just throw the ball to him in the post every play. And that just doesn't happen in the NBA. The problem with me of like projecting Edey in a negative way and dismissing him as an NBA player, there just aren't guys like him. Like he's such an outlier. Like I don't know who you even point to. I know people talk about Boban. To me, that's just nonsense. He is so clearly more skilled and more together physically in terms of basketball to me than someone like Boban. Like I think a little bit of Jonas Valanciunas, but like even Jonas is like small compared to Zach Edey,
Yeah, no, and like he's a better spot shooter than Klinger.
Right. Yeah.
Now, but listen, I've watched Steven Adams make 8 threes in a row in practice.
Right.
So like
right.
I'm not going googly-eyed over these guys in a 3-point star drill at the combine. It's just not going to happen. But I think
Edey has better free throw percentages in college, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have bad. It's not like he has a bad. Like he can be a pick and pop guy, but maybe not a 3-point pick and pop guy, an elbow pick and pop guy, a little bit more so. But I just found that interesting. Like, I mean, most of these guys are not going to tell you, but Edey seemed excited about the potential of the Grizzlies. So that was of note. Jacoby Walter was kind of the same way. Baylor freshman who we got to see play in the NCAA tournament in Memphis. He said Memphis has been interested. He's going to be meeting with Memphis at the combine. He was the other one that really just was pretty upfront about it. Some players suggested that they were meeting with the Grizzlies by saying, yeah, I'm meeting with pretty much everybody in the lottery,
Right.
But Jacoby Walter is an interesting player. I don't know if he's quite as NBA ready as some of these other guys just because he's a freshman, but I think the talent is clearly there, and I do think he projects to be a pretty good shooter. So that was interesting to me. And then another one of the players that we talked about a lot, Stephon Castle, he was interesting in the other way. He was like, I'm a point guard, and I'm going to play point guard in the NBA. And
did you see you were there? So you were in the middle of it instead of from afar, but they messed up his measurements initially. Did you see that?
No, he was 6'2" in the first measurement.
Yeah, that's wrong. That was only like a typo. Like that's what was put out. That was what was put out. And apparently what I read is someone entered Devin Carter's measurements into like the Stephon Castle file because it came out and people were freaking out. Like, wait a minute, we thought he was 6'5", 6'6". He's only 6'2". Turns out, no, he is like 6'5" or whatever,
But he was like, I'm a point guard and I want to play point guard in the league. And so then you get to asking, I'm like, well, if you're meeting with these teams in the lottery and the Grizzlies have a superstar point guard, a player like Ja Morant, how do you fit? And he's like, well, I can be flexible, but I sacrificed in college and played this role, and we went on and were very successful. And I hope I get some credit basically for doing that. Right. But at the same time, this is my career now, and I'm a pro now, and I've played point guard my whole life, and I envision myself as a point guard. He wouldn't be playing point guard if he was on the Grizzlies. He might play a little point guard, especially but he wouldn't be the main point guard.
Especially if Marcus Smart is still on the team, and then you have Bane, and then he would feel kind of a little bit buried in terms of that role on the depth chart. That's for sure, at least next season.
So I did find that interesting. I still like him as a prospect, and he did shoot the ball well yesterday. Like, unlike Edey, I do – maybe this is just my bias in play, but I think Castle's a better shooter than he was at UConn. Like, when you shoot a low volume and you don't shoot a high percentage, it doesn't necessarily reflect how good of a shooter you are. And he did shoot a low volume, but that's because UConn had awesome shooters all over the place. Like, they didn't want him to be the one taking the threes. So he might be a little bit better of a shooter than I think we've seen. But he was interesting to me. Another one of the interesting, you mentioned Filipowski. he's meeting with a lot of the teams in the lottery. 9 feels like maybe it's slightly high for him. I don't know. It could
well,
be.
it does based on the movement of all these mock drafts we read. But like he was considered that level before the sort of early in the season, and it's never been clear to me why he's drifted down. I will note a friend of the pod, John Hollinger, actually has him 9th on his prospect rankings that came out yesterday.
I want to get into what John Hollinger wrote, but let's get through Filipowski first. So he talked specifically about definitely being more comfortable as a 4 than as a 5. But depending on the type of team that drafts him, and he spoke a lot about how important it is to go to the right team. Depending on the type of team that drafts him, he can see himself being used as a small ball 5 for teams that want to play 5 out. And I think the Grizzlies would like to be able to play 5 out since you have Jaren Jackson Jr. I think that would be
right.
a plus. And he also mentioned, he said specifically, I'm not trying to brag about this, but I think where I might be the most important player in this draft is being able to be paired with a dynamic guard, because I see myself working extremely well with one of the dynamic guards like a Ja or a Trey Young or, someone of that
right.
fit, or SGA. I'm just coming up with names now. I'm not suggesting any of these teams would actually draft him, but because I feel like my speed, my quickness, and my size give me a big advantage in situations where I can set screens and I can beat somebody to the spot, and there is a point guard that can pass, that's on the ball, or can get all the way to the basket. And he said, I think, honestly, that's probably my number one thing. I might be the most important player here in terms of I viewed as a big that can be paired with a dynamic guard. What do you think about that?
Confidence, I guess.
Yeah,
it's kind of a wild thing to say. I have found myself more interested in Filipowski than most throughout this process. And partly I was looking at centers more than other players during the season because the Grizzlies, obvious need once you get past the trade deadline. But I just think he's a really skilled basketball player. I think those dribble, pass, shoot skills as a 7-footer, and I know he's not like a center in the way that Klingon and Edie are, but he's not scrawny either. He's like a solid 7-foot. He's sort of like a little bit stronger, physically stronger Santi Aldama kind of situation. I just think his dribble, pass, shoot skills at that size are like pretty valuable and pretty easy to plug into basketball teams. And I think for the Grizzlies in particular, if I'm looking for someone at 9 who can just step right in and play, now all these guys could be busts. So like no one's guaranteed to be able to step right in and play, but his skill set and the Grizzlies' lack of depth in the front court, to me, there's just such an easy path for him to step right into the rotation on a team like Memphis.
Okay, we have a few more things to get to. Have you watched any of Devin Carter? He interests me.
Not a lot. He seems like exactly the kind of player I love, but the Grizzlies sort of already have a lot of these. Like, it's like we have Marcus Smart and Vince Williams already if I'm the Grizzlies. But like bulldog, guard wings who rebound above their size. That's sort of Vince Williams. I like him a lot. I wonder if he's too duplicative of some stuff the Grizzlies already have right now.
Yeah, I do too. But it's interesting to compare him to a player like, say, Reed Shepherd.
Well, and then I don't know if we mentioned this on the pod, but he's the son of Grizzlies assistant coach Anthony Carter, right?
I believe so. I don't want to speak.
I'm pretty sure he is. I've read that places where people talk about the Miami Heat. Like he'd be a great fit there because his dad was a coach there and all this kind of stuff.
So yeah, he interests me. Reed Shepherd interests me. Reed Shepherd talked today. I know there's a lot of Grizzlies fans that have interest in Dalton Connect. Dalton Connect essentially said, my pitch is I'm going to help you right away because I know that I'm going to shoot the ball well. And so if you're looking for shooting and spacing, I can bring that immediately. And I do think that would be the case, whether if you want to spend the number 9 pick on a player that's mostly a shooter, I think is a question for the Grizzlies. What I like about Reed Shepherd is I think he could play on the ball a little bit more. I think he has experience playing on and off the ball because he played with 2 other dynamic point guards in college. He obviously shoots it really well. Defensively, he's pretty disruptive, even though he's small. So I think I like Reed Shepherd more. I think I like him the most of the guard options for the Grizzlies. Potentially be there at number 9. He also could be gone in the top 3. That's the theme of this draft. But it was good to talk to all these guys. I put it together this morning. There's more guys I'll talk to this afternoon. I'll talk to both of the Tigers guys. I will talk to maybe even Bronny James. Bronny James. I mean,
who might fill up the Landers Center next season? Do you see that?
So, yeah, come on, give me a break,
right,
dude. All right, so
that's the dumbest thing I've heard in basketball circles in the last 2 weeks. Definitely, that he's going to sell out G League arenas because Brian James is playing in the G League. Ain't nothing going to sell out G League arenas. Hate to break it to you.
We've got to move quickly here because I'm going to have to get back. But Lakers or Knicks for Bronny James?
Lakers. I don't care. If we're running out of time, let's get into the coaching stuff.
Okay. Well, we've got a little bit of time. Real quick before we get into coaching stuff, and then I'll make my point. But Ron Holland was number 1 on Hollinger's list. Yeah. I actually spoke to Hollinger today, and he said, he's kind of been at the top from the beginning, and I don't know why people moved him down. I didn't love Ron. I didn't love Ron Holland. Hollinger and Holland is going to be that's tough. I didn't love him as I was watching, just because I'm not sure how good the shooting is, and I don't know if the Grizzlies need another slashing wing. But he's big and he's versatile and he can defend. And any interest?
He is. I started, other than like the big men in college basketball who I watched a lot of, I sort of started with like guys higher in these most recent mocks as I've been going through. So Holland, to me, he had sort of drifted down. So he was in the class more with Cody Williams and Dalton Connect, of guys who I've only recently got around to looking at. And I do, even before the Hollingers thing came out, I do prefer Holland to those 2 guys. I'm not sure how I feel about him relative to Castle and Shepherd and some of the guys who have been up higher. And so I don't know about, that. But in terms of a guy I would consider at 9, yeah, I like him more than again, Connect and Williams, I think. I like the size, the athleticism. I mean, he's not big, but the Grizzlies have really small wings when you look at Smart and Kennard, and even Vince Williams is probably 6'4", 6'5". So Holland's more 6'7". He's athletic, high defensive upside, high energy. I think that kind of stuff would add a lot to the Grizzlies, but it certainly does not address the 2 biggest needs, which is the center position and shooting.
Okay, we have about 6 minutes until we're done here. So let's get into the coaching stuff real quick. I'll say what I think I can say, or what I do know. We did have breaking news yesterday that the Grizzlies hired Noah LaRoche as an assistant and head of player development for the Grizzlies. Obviously, that seems to be a pretty big hire, considering he comes with a lot of work alongside some of the NBA's biggest stars, whether that be Paul George, Jalen Green, Russell Westbrook, Diane Taurasi from the WNBA. And so this is clearly a hire that the Grizzlies probably had to make worthwhile to him, because if you're running a successful player development shop, those things are huge during the summers. You've got, even Jaron's out there working with specified trainers. So to bring on a guy like that, I think is something that everyone should be excited about. I think it was a pretty good hire by the Grizzlies, in my opinion. Of course, there's also the report that came from Kelly Iko. I hope I didn't mispronounce his last name, of The Athletic, that the Grizzlies are making a lot of staff changes.
Well, and Mark Stein had written something similar to that before, that right. He was hearing changes were coming. Yeah.
Yes. I would say this is what I do know of the changes, just to give it a little bit more nuance, because there's a lot of questions about, well, who's staying and who's going, and they hired a player development guy. Does that mean Anthony Carter is gone? Like, I think there's some dust that needs to settle here still.
Sure.
For the Grizzlies. I think it is likely that the Grizzlies are going to bring on several new faces this year. I don't think there's been some mass exodus in firings from the team, and that has not happened yet. Will there be a reshuffling of the staff? I think there will be. Will that lead to maybe some of the staff ending up in other places? I think that's a possibility. But we can't really say for sure who's where, who's in what role, because we don't know. Like, until these coaches are officially on board, like whoever they might be interested in, everybody's going to remain in the same roles. So,
well, the Grizzlies had 2 assistants leave for different reasons, 2 assistants out and two new assistants in last summer. And so some level of change is pretty normal year to year. It does sound like this might be a little bit more dramatic than your typical year to year. But again, like last year, it was, 2 assistants out, 2 new assistants in. So, there's not like full continuity every season.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it happens every single year. You do have new coaches come in and out. You're right. And again, like I haven't, from what I've heard, I don't view it as some like they fired a whole bunch of people. I don't think a bunch of people have been fired. Like I just don't believe that to necessarily be true at this point. Will there be staff turnover? Will there be changes? I do believe that will be true. I also, it's worth noting, we're here in Chicago. Every front office executive is here. All the major scouts are here, and all of these teams are talking. And are there people on the Grizzlies staff that other teams probably have interest in hiring? Yes. It happens to every team across the league every year.
Well, to me, what's most interesting from the broader sense, though, is like, to what degree do the staffing changes suggest changes to basketball philosophy or on-court strategy? I think there's been some like jumping to conclusions about that based on this hire that you've reported. I think that sort of remains to be seen. It may or may not be an indicator of some more significant changes in approach. But that's the thing that will probably ultimately matter most to most people watching games.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
Exactly. If this new hire is going to bring in a new philosophy for their offense. Like, I don't know if that would be true or not, but I would guess that the player development coach that you're hiring typically isn't the player that's trying to structure the offense. That's not reporting. That is a literal guess. But based on the title alone, I would guess that that's not how it works. And I would also say that Taylor Jenkins, I'm sure, has a big hand in deciding whatever that may or may not be. But those philosophies offensively or defensively. So, yeah, there might be some staff changes, but I don't think it's quite as dramatic as Grizzlies fans have sort of run with it as, if that makes sense. So we'll see what happens. I'm sure there will be more movement. There will be more to report later on this summer, and make sure you're checking the Daily Memphian if you want all of those updates. I'm about to go back and watch these games. I have like 1 minute until they begin, so I'm going to wrap it up here.
Remember, Drew, there's a pick at like 56 or something. You got to go scout.
Yes, I've got to go scout Bronny James, man. Bronny James, the Grizzlies. We're gonna draft Bronny James. I'm speaking as Zach Kleiman, and we are going to pack the Lander Center. So who knows? I mean, maybe it could happen. Maybe it'll be true. But until next time, for Drew and for Chris, we're out here.